Okay, welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to jump right into a truly chilling, true story today. We're breaking down the case of a small town doctor who used his white coat not to heal people, but to hide a completely undetected killing spree that lasted for 2 decades. So, this isn't just your standard true crime story about a bad guy. We're doing a deep dive into the actual anatomy of a massive systematic medical deception.
Right off the bat, I want you to genuinely think about this for a second. Who would actually question a respected doctor's professional judgment? When a physician walks into a room wearing that crisp white coat, carrying a medical degree, we are practically culturally conditioned to just surrender all our skepticism. We're going to explore this inherent blind spot today because, honestly, this absolute unquestioning trust in medical authority figures, that was the literal foundation of this entire tragedy.
Section 1, a trusted town fixture. To really wrap our heads around how this happened, we have to look at his public persona. To the town, this doctor had a calming voice, he donated to local charities, he was always at town events. Mothers brought their kids to him, elderly couples scheduled their monthly checkups with him like clockwork. He was, by all accounts, an essential pillar of the community. But behind closed clinic doors, the private reality was night and day. He kept locked cabinets full of totally unauthorized medications. He would routinely dismiss nurses from the examination room. It's this terrifying juxtaposition, right? The caring, smiling man the town saw versus the calculated predator operating just out of sight.
And that brings us to a really absolutely crucial realization. The saying goes he had built decades of trust, and trust like that doesn't get questioned. It gets relied upon. This foundational trust wasn't just a happy byproduct of him being a friendly guy. No, it was an active primary weapon. He cultivated that specific image to avoid detection. I mean, he knew full well that no one goes looking for a killer hiding behind a warm smile and a stethoscope. Moving on to Section 2, the doctor's deadly methods. Let's look exactly at the mechanics of how he operated, because his protocol was brutally methodical. First, he'd target an isolated elderly patient. Second, he'd dismiss the nursing staff from the room. And finally, he would personally administer an unauthorized injection. Actually, a retired nurse later admitted she always found it kind of unsettling that he insisted on doing routine injections himself, procedures that nurses typically handle all the time. But back then, it was just written off as a quirky doctor thing. So, who were these patients? They fit a very specific, heartbreaking target profile. We're talking isolated, elderly individuals with barely any family members checking in on them. These were folks who relied heavily on him, not just for healthcare, but honestly for companionship. And most disturbingly, they were often patients who had recently made modifications to their estate plans. But here's the twist. Investigators found out his motive wasn't purely financial gain. It was really about a profound psychological need for control. He got this dark, twisted satisfaction from being their literal lifeline, and then getting to decide exactly when that lifeline would be cut. Section 3. Exploiting systemic blind spots. Now, this is exactly how he manipulated medical oversight to his advantage, and it is a real eye-opener. He would induce symptoms using those unauthorized medications we talked about, things causing confusion, weakness, or cardiac irregularities. But then, on the actual death certificates, he just lists complications from age, underlying conditions, or heart failure. It was incredibly calculated. He deliberately selected substances that perfectly mimicked natural elderly decline because he absolutely knew, that elderly deaths, especially folks with pre-existing conditions, they almost never trigger autopsies or toxicology screens. He literally used the lack of checks and balances in elderly care to render himself completely invisible to the system. To understand the kind of mind capable of pulling this off, we have to talk about compartmentalization. Psychologists who evaluated him later noted his eerie composure. He had this profound psychological ability to just completely separate his public, caring persona from his hidden, murderous actions. He even held on to this twisted, bizarre belief that his murders were some kind of mercy service, which is crazy, completely ignoring the fact that his victims were not actually suffering and were actively coming to him to extend their lives. Section 4. Unraveling with dissection. So, how do you catch a predator who literally controls the very system meant to identify him? Well, you need a disruption. And that disruption came from a grieving daughter who absolutely refused to accept that her healthy mother's sudden death was just her time. Within days of her mother passing, she starts asking hard questions. Fast forward a few weeks, she uncovers 4 similar deaths of previously stable elderly patients in the same town. Months go by, and she finally gets that retired nurse to admit to the doctor's unsettling little quirks.
A year in, she partners with an investigative journalist who maps out the whole massive pattern, which years later finally leads to ordered exhumations. It's just an incredible escalation, right? Going from quiet whispered questions in a small town to the staggering realization of a 2-decade-long killing pattern. When investigators finally got a search warrant, the physical evidence was just undeniable. They found those locked, unauthorized medications matching the deadly substances used. They found non-standard, highly personal patient notes where he was weirdly observing their daily routines and family dynamics. And, maybe worst of all, they found tracking logs of patient wills and estates, noting whenever he was added as a beneficiary, no matter how small the amount was. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his actions were methodical, calculated, and deeply invasive. 20. I want you to just let that number sink in for a second. 20. For nearly 20 years, this man operated in plain sight. Dozens of funerals were quietly mourned. Dozens of deaths were simply accepted as just, a natural part of aging. It took 2 whole decades before toxicology reports from exhumed bodies finally confirmed the undeniable truth. The sheer massive scale of this deception is just breathtaking.
Section 5. The cost of blind trust.
The fallout for this particular community was absolutely devastating. I mean, families had to endure the agonizing process of literally exhuming their loved ones, ripping open old wounds they thought had healed years ago, all just to find the truth. The unquestioning trust they once had in their medical providers, that was permanently shattered. Because, as it turns out, sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones we're taught to trust the most. The ones wearing the white coats, carrying the fancy medical degrees, concealing something no one could have ever imagined. It's a really terrifying realization that the most dangerous people rarely look the part. So I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought today. What gaps in oversight are leaving the isolated and vulnerable completely unprotected in your own community? Think about it. This doctor exploited a system that dismissed the elderly, a system that totally lacked the checks and balances needed to question a trusted authority figure. We really have to ask ourselves, are those exact same systemic failures present around us today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions and, seriously, never stop looking for the truth.